Rust is perhaps one of the most popular survival games of all time. Starting off as a zombie-centrified, almost DayZ clone, it's now become something way bigger and way more popular than anyone could have ever imagined. But did you know at one point there was going to be a number of spin-offs, and one being a medieval fantasy world? It was called Ruin. But what happened to it? Why did it never come to be? What is the story behind Rust's medieval fantasy spin-off? Of course, the game as we know it today was created by Gary Newman. Facepunch Studios, his company, was founded in June of 2004 to then be incorporated in 2009. Their first game was Garry's Mod, a sandbox game that tinkers with Valve's Source engine, which was able to take assets from other games such as Half-Life 2, Team Fortress, and Portal. The game let players do, well, pretty much whatever they want, from creating their own maps to completely sandbox experiences, and my, was it a success. As of September 2021, it has sold over 20 million copies, giving a tidy profit for Facepunch Studios to go on and create something new. And that's where Rust comes in. First released in early access in December of 2013, it was said to initially be more of a clone of DayZ. Of course, the popular Arma 2 mod, which is now its own standalone game. It was almost a mix of that with Minecraft, including building and crafting elements. Yet that era of Rust is now long gone, considered to almost be a legacy version. It has way less features than what we have today and an entirely different graphic style, being way more dull and grey. But the game also had zombies, as I mentioned. These were later removed as people found that they weren't actually necessary to what Rust later became to be. It then evolved with better graphics, gameplay, and content to give way more creativity to the players to almost decide their own stories. But the company wanted to do a little bit more. They had an idea that started by the name of Moss. Now, I know I've completely thrown a different name out there, but it will make sense very, very shortly. Moss was announced on Facepunch's official website as a prototype in July of 2017. It was described as a medieval sword and sorcery fantasy game, built using the systems we developed using Rust, which I assumed would be the building, food systems, and, just making a true fantasy version of that. Although it would have been different, with a variety of NPCs that you'd be able to drop specific items, and of course towns with shops and trading in there. Not only this, but there are full ability trees to go down, from finesse to might and magic. They're kind of self-explanatory in themselves, with the mention of changing things like ore nodes that we have in Rust, which can spawn anywhere above ground or in caves, are spread across 3 different types: stone, metal, sulfur. In Moss, they would only spawn in mine shafts, which could be surrounded by enemies, of course giving you the opportunity to get the better resources, but also needing the equipment in order to do so. Nodes would have the possibility to drop gems, which could be used to upgrade your equipment and weapons. At the time, it's not stated how, but it could have been like other MMOs where it's just a stat change or maybe an effect like fire and ice. There was also the mention of adding in shields, which would be a big feature many people have wanted in Rust. It would allow the possibility of blocking attacks like arrow and magic, and having a full combat system, having parrying and shield bashing added in there. Additionally, horse riding at the time was not a feature in Rust, something that is now a big part of that game, but that was also mentioned to be something they were working on for Moss. We have seen a few screenshots here and there, things like having a dragon in the sky, and this screenshot here looks fantastic, but it looks like it's more of just an ideas and concept art, more than anything that was actually developed so far. But as time went on, the project started to change and morph around. It was then given the new name of Ruin. You see where that comes in now. They showed off a castle and snowy biomes with cave entrances, a throne room which looked like a boss area, a prison section which could be filled with mobs like the skeletons shown off before in other screenshots. They mentioned things like the towns were being finished with guards stationed around that could attack enemy NPCs or hostile players, and altogether it was starting to become this new game that really started to form into something special. They then reportedly added in catacombed areas, which were filled with dangerous mobs like zombies and skeletons. They also showed off magic, which works by holding the appropriate items in your hand, for example an ice staff or a fire staff, and of course being able to cast spells, so forth. Melee combat was something that was still being worked on, and we didn't really get to see all that much of it, but it was said to be based around a mountain blade style system. Ruin was going to be something completely different, less of a multiplayer run survival and more of an RPG. Of course, we mentioned things like NPCs, but having full boss fights, dungeons that you can go into, things like dragons, hobgoblins, and giant rat-like creatures wandering around that could deal some serious damage. But with all this promise and passion around Ruin, or Moss as it was once called, what happened to it? where did it go? Well, in April of 2018, an announcement was made. It said the following: while the idea of a medieval version of Rust with a fantasy game element was appealing, Ruin never really managed to escape Rust's shadow, at least not enough to define its own gameplay. Ruin had elements that were very similar and some almost identical to Rust, things like crafting, looting, or harvesting, and the features that set it apart from the initial game were kind of problematic. The huge handcrafted world would have needed constant expanding and updating to keep players interesting. The missions would get repetitive and boring unless they constantly added new ones. It just ended up becoming something that the developers knew they wouldn't be able to sustain, at least for long periods of time. It's also easy to see that the game would fall into a lot of the same development pitfalls as Rust itself: server DDoSing, cheating, hostile and toxic community. Now, Rust is able to sort of manage that with one project for Facepunch Studios to work on, but imagine if you had two of them at the same time. Not only would that have massive resource increases for the development studio themselves, but it would just be so hard to sustain. I think this was such a missed opportunity, and given some time, this game could have been a massive hit. I mean, imagine it, Rust but medieval. I know we've had something similar that's kind of on the horizon, a game called Reknown that's almost trying to take that Rust element of the survival and big multiplayer world, but adding it into the medieval genre, having an almost Mordhau inspired combat system, and it's starting to look really promising. But Ruin already had a community Discord at the time. It had a fan website, and a lot more of the Rust community was very excited about this. But the resources taken to develop such a thing would have been vast, and since Rust is so profitable, why would they bother splitting their resources like this? But it's a sad thing. Part of the responsibility for it not happening was maybe down to the community of Rust, not wanting to split it, or just the complete change in development, trying to make more of an RPG rather than a player-run survival world. Now, I just want to mention before I finish this video, a lot of the content from this is really hard to find. Of course, there are screenshots and bits out there, but most of this has been looked into by a YouTuber called shadowfrax, who does large Rust update stuff, and finding separate footage was very tricky, so there is some stuff that I've credited to their channel, so please go and check this out. A lot of it isn't my own things, but let me know what you think. Do you think this could have been a success? But what are the main reasons for its eventual downfall? Let me know in the comments below. But leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't. But until then, I will see you in the next one.